Somewhere within reach of where you're lying tonight, there is probably a piece of chalk, a stub of it in a drawer, a smear of it on a child's hands, or just the white face of a far-off cliff in a photograph on a wall. We handle the stuff without a thought. It is one of the softest, plainest, most ordinary things in the world, and it is made almost entirely of the dead. Held up to the light, a fragment shows nothing strange, a soft white solid, faintly powdery, cool against the skin. Put it under a microscope though, and the white comes apart into shapes. Tiny plates and discs, ridged and wheel-like, packed together by the million, each one the calcite shell of a single-celled alga, so small that 1,000 of them could sit on the head of a pin. Coccolithophores, we call them, the plankton that built the chalk. Every plate was grown by something alive, and everyone drifted in sunlit water before sinking, slowly, to the floor of a warm, shallow sea. The cliffs we've named for that chalk, the white walls of Dover, the pale ridges that run across Europe, are nothing more and nothing less than that long snowfall of the dead, gone on until it hardened to stone. The sea that made the chalk has a name. We call its whole long age the Cretaceous, after the Latin word for chalk, Creta, because when the first geologists mapped these pale layers across Europe, the chalk was the thing the rocks most obviously shared. The name has held for 200 years. There is something fitting in having named an entire age of the world after the slow falling of plankton. The Cretaceous ran from roughly 143 million years ago to about 66. That is some 77 million years, longer on its own than the whole age of mammals that came after it. Everything that has happened since the last great dinosaurs died, the whales returning to the sea, the grasses spreading, the first primates, the first upright step, all of it fits inside a stretch of time shorter than the Cretaceous alone. And the world that filled those 77 million years would be only half familiar to you. It was warmer than ours, warm almost from pole to pole. No great ice caps sat at the top and bottom of the planet. In their place grew forests and broad, slow rivers and dinosaurs that lived through months of winter darkness near the poles. The seas stood far higher than they do today, high enough to drown the middle of the continents. You could have sailed clear across North America over warm water that closed above the ground where wheat now grows. Stand on almost any shore in this world and the air would be soft and close, the light a touch hazier than before, the first flowers newly opened along the dunes behind you. Out at the edge of the water, the shapes moving through the shallows would be strange to you in a way that's hard to name. Creatures the earth has not made since, with no living thing quite like them. This was the last and the longest chapter in the age of the dinosaurs. The animals we picture when we say the word belong here, most of them. The great tyrant with the heavy head, the three-horned face, the long-necked giants taller than anything that has walked the earth since. It is also the age that ends with the most famous single day in the history of life, when something fell out of the sky and the long warmth closed like a door. We'll walk all the way to that day, slowly, in time. Not yet, though. For now, it's enough to stand on the threshold and feel how much world is waiting on the far side of it. There's a particular quiet that comes from holding a very long time in the mind, not the quiet of feeling small, though we are small. It's nearer to the feeling of a child falling asleep in the back of a moving car, the grown-ups talking low in the front, the road unrolling in the dark. Something larger than us is awake out there, and has been for a very long time, and will still be awake long after we've closed our eyes. The chalk has been falling for 100 million years, and it is still falling tonight, in seas we will never see. We're allowed to rest inside something that old. Before we step through the door, one quiet word, and then we'll go. If you find yourself drawn to these slow descents into deep time, to the long, calm stories the Earth has been keeping all along, consider subscribing, and we'll go on making these journeys together. There's no hurry in it. The worlds we visit have waited a very long time. They can wait for us. And if you'd like to, leave a note in the comments to say where you're listening from tonight, your city, the hour where you are. It's a quiet pleasure to see how far around the world this slow signal travels, and to know we're all lying awake under the same old sky, thinking about the same lost seas. Now let's begin where those lost seas began, with a world coming quietly apart, new oceans opening where there had been dry land, and the slow drift of the continents toward the shapes we would one day call home. Near the middle of the world, a little over 120 million years ago, a long, low valley lies open under a hot sky. The ground here is black and new, fresh basalt, cooled from lava that pushed up through the cracks not long before. Shallow lakes lie across the floor, their edges crusted white with salt, and the salt is printed here and there with the tracks of something that came down to drink and then wandered off. The air shimmers and carries the low smell of sulfur and brine, and the only sound is the wind working over open rock. Down the center of the valley runs a fracture in places narrow enough to step across. That fracture is an ocean. On one side lies the rock that will drift west and become South America. On the other, the rock that will become Africa. They are pulling away from each other, slowly, without a sound, a few centimeters a year, and the sea keeps trying to move in. It floods the valley from the south, turns it into a long, warm lagoon, then draws back under the sun and leaves the salt behind, floods and dries and floods again. This is what the birth of an ocean really looks like. A low basin learning, across millions of years, how to hold the sea. Nothing as sudden as a parting, just water arriving and leaving and finally staying. That salt is still down there, by the way, a buried layer of dried-out Cretaceous lagoons, kilometers beneath the South Atlantic floor, that the modern world now drills through to reach the oil trapped under it. The Earth had been rehearsing this for a long time. Well before the Cretaceous, nearly all the land had been gathered into one enormous mass, a supercontinent we call Pangaea, and Pangaea had already begun to break apart, back in the age of the earliest dinosaurs. By the time our story opens, the breakup is well along and quickening. Up north, the lands that would become North America, Europe, and much of Asia are drifting clear of the southern ones, the great huddle of Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, and India. The old names for these two halves are Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. And through the Cretaceous, they keep coming apart at the seams, the way a single sheet of pack ice splits into flows and drifts. The seam that opens the South Atlantic is the one to watch. It unzips from the bottom up. The southern tips of Africa and South America part first, around 130 million years ago, and from there the tear travels north. Slow, as everything here is slow, until by about 104 million years ago, the two continents have finally let go. A new ocean now runs the length of the world, from south to north, where before there had been unbroken land. We can read that join the way we read a torn page. The coastlines of South America and Africa still answer each other, the bulge of Brazil fitting the hollow of the African coast like two pieces of one thing. Match the rocks across the gap and the same old layers line up on both sides, the same fossils of the same vanished animals in the ground in Brazil and in West Africa, set down before the two ever parted. The continents remember having been joined long after the ocean between them has grown 3,000 miles wide. Seen up close in any single moment, none of this is dramatic. Continents move at about the speed a fingernail grows, a few centimeters a year, no faster. Nothing alive could have felt it. A dinosaur might have lived its whole long life on that widening coast and died without the shoreline shifting one visible step. And yet the patience of deep time turns that crawl into something staggering. Give a fingernail's pace 100 million years and it will open an ocean 3,000 miles across. If you could stand on one of these new shores, say the eastern edge of a young South America, looking out over water that has no name yet, the wind off the sea would come warm and wet against your face. You would feel no chill in it at all, even in the depth of what we would call winter. The light would fall a little softer than today, filtered through a heavier, warmer air. That warmth is the other half of the story here, and the breakup helped make it. Pulling continents apart is violent work far below. It means long undersea ridges swelling with hot rock and volcanoes breathing carbon dioxide into the air across millions of years. The Cretaceous air held far more of that gas than ours does, likely past 1,000 parts per million, though the exact number is still argued over. A wide tropical ocean lay open around the equator. Its currents carried that heat to the ends of the Earth, to poles that wore no ice at all. Even the deep sea ran warm. The cold black water that today sits a hair above freezing stood at around 20 degrees, warm as a bath left to cool. The seas, meanwhile, stood much higher than they do today. By the best estimates, something like 170 meters above where they rest now, give or take a great deal. Part of that was simply the lack of ice on land, but that comes nowhere near explaining all of it. If every sheet of ice on Earth now were to melt, the seas would climb only about 70 meters. The Cretaceous oceans stood far higher, and with no ice to draw on. The extra water was pushed up out of the deep basins by all the fresh, hot seafloor the breakup kept making. The ocean floor itself rising, lifting the sea over the rims of the continents and drowning their low interiors. And these warm, shallow, drowning seas are the ones that will lay down the chalk, filling with plankton, raining calcite into the dark, thickening over the ages into pale stone. Not every fragment drifted quietly. One of them set out on a journey so long and so fast by the standards of moving continents that it still stands apart from all the rest. Around 88 million years ago, India broke from the last of its southern neighbors and began to travel north, alone, across open water. Over the tens of millions of years that followed it, gathered speed, until it was crossing the sea at perhaps 18 to 20 centimeters a year, twice the pace of an ordinary continent, a fingernail growing fast. An entire subcontinent was crossing an entire ocean, carrying its own forests and rivers and animals, none of which had the faintest idea they were aboard anything at all. It would not arrive, would not crash into Asia and begin to lift the Himalayas until long after our story has closed. And as the pieces drifted, they carried their living cargo apart with them. Lands that had shared the same animals slowly stopped sharing them. Cut off by new water, the creatures stranded on each fragment began to change in their own directions, down separate roads. On the northern continents, one cast of characters. On the southern, another entirely. The largest giants of the south would have no equal in the north, and a hunter from one land would have been an utter stranger on the next. Each drifting raft of rock was quietly becoming its own experiment in what an animal could be. So this is the stage, the familiar world map, but rewound and caught in the middle of becoming itself, the continents loose and adrift, the oceans young, the climate soft and warm from end to end. Mountains we think of as eternal are young here, or not yet raised. Coastlines we would swear by are still far out to sea. There is a strange calm in watching it from here, in knowing how it all turns out, and in knowing that even the ground beneath us is never truly still, that the solid earth only moves too slowly for one life to feel it. And on all that fresh, drifting land, the new coastlines, the river deltas spilling into the new seas, the wide floodplains laid down between the rifts. Something was taking hold that the world had never seen before. Something low and quiet, scattered in among the ferns and the conifers, and just beginning to open. Of all the things that happened in the age of the giant dinosaurs, the largest animals ever to walk the earth, the most powerful hunters life had yet built, the one that would change the world most lastingly was none of them. It was small enough to hold between two fingers. It was a flower. Kneel at the edge of one of those new floodplains, early in the Cretaceous, and part the ferns, and you might have found one of the very first of them, low to the ground, plain, nothing you would look at twice. A small bloom in a world that, until almost this moment, had never made a single flower. It is hard to picture, but for most of the history of life, the land had no flowers at all. The green of the world was a green of other kinds of plants, towering conifers, low ferns and horsetails, cycads with their stiff crowns, the broad fans of the ginkgo. They reproduced by cones and dust-fine spores, casting their pollen to the wind and hoping. It was a handsome world, and an ancient one, but it was a world without petals, without nectar, without fruit. Nothing bloomed, nothing offered a reward worth eating. For hundreds of millions of years, that was simply how the land was. The first flowering plants, angiosperms in the language of botany, slipped into that world quietly, low down and easy to miss. Their oldest sure traces are grains of pollen, about 134 million years old, and one of the oldest near-complete flowers we have found is a slender water plant from around 125. They were not grand, they were weeds in the best sense, fast-growing opportunists that took hold on raw, disturbed ground, exactly the kind of bare floodplain and broken rift edge the restless continents were making everywhere. The breaking of the world had cleared the ground, and into that cleared ground the flowers came. What made them different was the bargain the bloom offered. A cone trusts its pollen to the wind, which is wasteful and blind. A flower makes a deal instead. It grows colours and scent and a sip of sugar, and in exchange an animal carries its pollen straight from one bloom to another of the same kind. Somewhere in all this, a dull little beetle crawls into one of those first flowers to feed and backs out dusted with gold, then carries that gold to the next bloom with no idea it has just done the plant a service. It is a faster, surer way to reproduce than trusting the wind, and it turned plants and animals into partners as the world had not seen before. Beetles came to the early flowers first, then flies, and in time the bees. Think of what that did to the air and the light. A flower's colour is a signal, the first time in the history of the world that a plant had something to say to an animal, and it said so in colour. A flower's scent is an invitation, carried on the wind to a nose or an antenna some way off. Before this, the green world had been, in a sense, silent and scentless to its visitors. Now the land began, here and there, to advertise, to bloom in colours meant to be seen, and to give off the first floral perfume the world had known. The flower and its visitor have been at this for a very long time. The oldest bee we have ever found lies preserved in amber about 100 million years old, its body already carrying the branched hairs that catch and hold pollen. That handshake, the bloom and the one that comes to drink from it, is that ancient, and we are still living inside it. There is a strange twist buried in this story. We tend to imagine that butterflies and moths arose to drink from flowers, that the long curled tongue and the dusting of bright scales were made for the bloom. But the moths are older than the flowers. Their kind was already fluttering through the cone forests at least 200 million years ago, some 60 million years before the first petal ever opened. sipping at the sugary droplets the old cone-bearing plants produced. The flower did not invent its visitors. It arrived into a world that already had them and learned how to call them over. Once the flowers found that trick, they spread with a speed that has puzzled biologists ever since. Charles Darwin, late in his life, found their sudden rise in the fossil record so hard to square with his slow, patient view of evolution that he called it, in an 1879 letter to a friend, an abominable mystery. What unsettled him in particular was how quickly the broad-leaved flowering plants seemed to appear and take over the Cretaceous rocks. More than a century later, the mystery has not entirely closed. The rocks say the flowers appear around 130 million years ago. The molecules, the slow ticking of mutations counted backward through living plants, hint that the lineage may be older still, reaching down into the Jurassic, or by some readings further yet. Those two kinds of evidence have never quite been made to agree, and honest researchers still argue over the gap. It would be wrong, though, to picture the Cretaceous as suddenly carpeted in blossom. The takeover was real, but unhurried. For tens of millions of years, the flowering plants were just one thread among many, sharing the land with all those conifers and ferns. In the cooler, higher latitudes especially, the old cone-bearers held their ground and would go on holding it. Some of the forests the last dinosaurs walked through were still forests of needle and cone, not blossom. The flowers full inheritance of the earth, the meadows, the orchards heavy with fruit, the grasslands, the blossoming canopy, would not truly arrive until after the dinosaurs were gone. What began here, in these low weeds on broken ground, was not the victory. It was the opening of the door. The change, once it began, did not turn back. The flower's rise slowly pulled the rest of life along behind it. More kinds of flowers meant more kinds of insects to visit them, and more insects meant more food for the creatures that ate insects, and so on, upward, through the whole web of living things. Much of that cascade would only play out long after this age had ended. But it started here, the base of the living world being quietly rebuilt from the plants upward. And it is a door that nearly everything since has walked through. The fruit in your kitchen, the grain in the bread, the cotton against your skin tonight, the flowers someone might bring to a sickbed, all of it traces back to this quiet beginning among the ferns. We remember the giant dinosaurs from this age. They were extraordinary, and they are gone. The small flower on the broken ground is the one whose world we still live in. It is a quiet thing to sit with, that the gentlest thing this whole enormous age produced, not the teeth or the size we remember it for, turned out to be the part that lasted. The land then was being rewritten from the ground up. New continents, new coastlines, and now a slow green tide of flowers creeping across the broken plains, drawing the insects in after it. A whole world was taking shape, green, blossoming, beginning to hum. And the question that hangs over all of it is the simplest one there is, across this changing, flowering, humming land. What was walking? There is a small dinosaur found in the rocks of northeastern China whose color we know. It lived about 125 million years ago, and it was roughly the size of a turkey. It was ginger, a warm reddish-brown along the back, paler beneath, with a long tail banded in rings of dark and light, the way a raccoon's is. We are surer of that coloring than we are of the coloring of plenty of animals alive today. That ought to be impossible. Color is the first thing to vanish when a body dies, the soft, perishable signal of skin and feather and scale, gone within days, long before bone ever begins to turn to stone. To know the color of something that died before the flowers had finished spreading across the world, we needed a place where the ordinary rules of decay had been suspended. Such a place exists, and almost everything we are about to see comes out of it. In the early Cretaceous, the region we now call Liaoning was a country of quiet lakes and conifer forest, low hills and slow water, and it sat in the shadow of restless volcanoes. Every so often a volcano would wake, and a cloud of fine ash would settle over the lakes and the forest, smothering what lived there and sinking it into the still, airless mud of the lake floor. There the bodies lay, sealed away from scavengers and from the slow work of rot, pressed flatter and flatter as the ages stacked above them. What this produced, over and over, is the closest thing the fossil record has to a photograph. Whole animals laid out as they fell, feathers fanned around them, the last meal still in the stomach, in some cases the unhatched young still curled inside the egg. Each ashfall was a small catastrophe, and each one caught a single moment and held it. Geologists have a word for a deposit this rich. The rest of us can simply call it a window. The window was thrown open in the summer of 1996 by a farmer named Li Yumin, who collected fossils in his spare time around the village of Sihetun. Splitting a slab of fine grey shale, he found a small skeleton, and running the length of its neck, its back, and that long tail was a dark halo, a fringe of fine filaments standing out from the bone like fuzz. The slab broke cleanly into two matching halves, as these slabs do, and Li sold the halves to two different museums, so that the front and the back of the same animal ended up in two different cities. When the scientists saw it, they understood what the fuzz meant, and what it meant was enormous. They named the animal Sinosauropteryx, roughly the Chinese reptile feather. It was the first dinosaur that was not itself a bird ever found with feathers on its body, and it would not be the last. For a few scientists, this was the confirmation of an idea they had defended against the grain for a long time. Back in 1969, the American paleontologist John Ostrom had described a lithe, sickle-clawed predator called Deinonychus and noticed how bird-like its skeleton was. The light bones, the wrist that folded like a wing, the killing poise of the thing. He revived a suggestion first floated back in the 1800s, that birds had not merely descended from some distant reptile, but were themselves a kind of dinosaur, the living branch of a family we had assumed was wholly dead. For decades it stayed a minority view, brilliant but unproven, because the one thing missing was feathers. Feathers on an animal plainly a dinosaur, and plainly not a bird. The fuzz on that slab from Sihetun was the missing thing. The sparrow on the windowsill, it turns out, is a dinosaur, the last living twig of a family we thought had died. What came next, once people knew to look, was a flood. Liaoning gave up one feathered dinosaur after another, and the discoveries made two things plain. The first is that feathers came long before flight. Sinosauropteryx could not fly and never would. Its feathers were simple, downy filaments, good for warmth and very likely for show. A coat and a costume, not a wing. Flight came later, built out of equipment that had first evolved for other reasons entirely. The second is the sheer range of the animals wearing them. One, a glossy crow-sized hunter called Microraptor, carried long flight feathers not only on its arms but on its legs as well, 4 wings rather than 2, and almost certainly glided from tree to tree. Another, at the far end of the scale, was a tyrant 9 meters long and well over a ton called Tyrannosaurus, the beautiful feathered one, a cousin of the great predators still to come, and it too was clothed in shaggy down. Feathers, it turned out, ran right through the dinosaur family, far more widely than anyone had pictured. And then came the colours, which seemed the most impossible thing of all. The trick lies in structures called melanosomes, minute packets of pigment, far smaller than a single cell, that give feathers much of their colour in life. In the best preserved Liaoning fossils, these survive, and their shape is the clue. Packed sausage-shaped, The feather was black or grey. Packed round like tiny beads, it was reddish, a warm ginger. By matching the fossil shapes against the same structures in living birds, researchers could read a dead animal's colouring straight off the stone. That is how we know that small ginger hunter wore exactly the coat described. Its banded tail, its dark back shading to a paler belly, the same counter shading that hides a deer or a fox today. It is how we know Microraptor gleamed, a glossy, iridescent blue-black with the oily shimmer of a starling. The method has limits and honest ones. It reaches only the colours made by melanin, missing the reds and yellows built other ways, and it works only on fossils preserved finely enough to keep such things. But where it works, it does something that would have looked like sorcery a generation ago. It puts the colour back. If you could go back and stand at the edge of one of those liaoning lakes, in the living world, the ash would one day seal. You would not find the old museum monster there. The slow, scaly, grey-green giant dragging its tail through a swamp. You would find something stranger and far more alive. Small, quick, warm-blooded creatures, many of them clothed in down and colour, moving through the ferns and the first flowers like a flock of odd ground birds. Some would be calling to one another. Some would flash a banded tail to be seen. The world we walked into through the chalk is turning out, the deeper we go, to look less like the lost age of reptiles we were taught, and more like the dawn of the birds. And the famous monsters still ahead of us, the Tyrant, the horned giants, were near akin to that sparrow on the sill than to any lizard. And the ginger of that small dinosaur is a real colour, worn by a real animal on one particular morning 125 million years ago. That was a morning before the flowers had spread across the continents, before the chalk seas had formed, before almost everything else in this long story. The animal died and was buried, and still the colour stayed. A single feather pressed flat into grey stone is a fingerprint left by one life on one day, kept legible across a stretch of time the mind cannot really hold. We are not guessing at these creatures from a heap of broken bone. In the best of these fossils, we are very nearly looking at them. All of this, the down, the colours, the flock of ground birds at the water's edge, is held in slabs of lakebed shale small enough to lift in two hands, fine grey stone laid down quietly at the bottom of still water. But that still water was not the only water rising in this world. While these lakes filled and dried in the east, far across the warming planet, the sea itself was climbing, spilling over the low edges of the continents, reaching inland, drowning the dry hearts of whole land masses beneath warm, shallow, sunlit ocean. One of those floods would cut a continent clean in two. What would it take to sail a boat clean across the middle of North America? Today the answer is that you can't. The whole bulk of a continent stands in the way, the high plains and the Rockies and 1,000 miles of dry land between the seas. But for much of the Cretaceous, you could have made that voyage without once touching shore. Open saltwater ran from the Arctic in the far north all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, straight over the ground where Denver and Dallas and Kansas City stand today. Geologists call that vanished ocean the Western Interior Seaway, and for much of the late Cretaceous it was one of the defining features of the planet, an inland sea that opened as the high greenhouse waters climbed over the low middle of the continent. At its fullest, it ran more than 3,000 kilometers from the Arctic down to the Gulf, and close to 1,000 kilometers from one shore to the other. It did something no sea does today. It split a single continent into two separate lands. To the west lay a long, narrow land we call Laramidia, a ribbon of coast and mountain running from Alaska down into Mexico, and the stage on which the most famous dinosaurs of all would live and die. To the east lay a broader, lower, gentler land called Appalachia. and between them rolled an inland ocean, so that an animal on the Laramidian shore looked out not on the rest of its continent, but on open water to the horizon, with another world entirely on the far side. The western shore of it, on an ordinary day 80 million years ago, was a low, warm coast under a hazy sky, the water glass clear and bath warm in the shallows, barely a ripple reaching the sand. It ran out flat and pale and shining as far as the eye could follow, shallow enough to wade far from the beach before it ever deepened past the waist. And somewhere out beyond the shallows, where the light turned blue, the slow rain of shells was already falling that would one day be stone. For all that width, it was not a deep ocean, and that is the detail that catches people off guard. Over most of its floor it lay no more than a few hundred meters from surface to bottom, and across great stretches far less than that. A broad sheet of warm, lit water spread thin over a drowned plain. Put the proportions side by side and the strangeness shows. A sea 1,000 kilometers wide and a few hundred meters deep is, for its size, astonishingly shallow. Shrink the whole thing down to the width of a dinner plate, and the water lying across it would be thinner than a coat of varnish. This was never a great blue abyss. It was a continent that had quietly gone under. And it would not hold still. Over the millions of years of its life, the seaway breathed, rising and spreading, then drawing back toward its center, then pressing forward again. Each time it advanced, the shoreline could travel hundreds of kilometers, swallowing coastal country that had been dry for ages. Each time it withdrew, it left that country behind, freshly floored in marine mud. A single hillside in Wyoming or Colorado can hold that whole rhythm in its layers: sea, then shore, then sea again, the same ground taken and given back a dozen times. The map of the continent was a restless thing, redrawn every few 100,000 years by water that could never quite decide where its edge belonged. The floor of that sea did not vanish when the water finally drained away. It is still here, lifted, dried, and turned into some of the best farmland on Earth, and you have very likely crossed it without a thought. Those flat wheat fields of Kansas and Nebraska, the high dry plains of the Dakotas, that wide and famously level middle of the continent so far from any coast, that is the bed of the Western Interior Seaway. Stand in a Kansas field on a still afternoon, with dry land running 1,000 miles in every direction. A warm ocean once closed over the very spot where you stand, hundreds of feet of green water overhead, alive with swimming things, where now there is only wind and wheat and an enormous sky. The flatness of the Great Plains is the flatness of a sea floor, kept. And in places, the floor of that sea is the very stone we walked in on. We have already seen what chalk is made of, the soft white rock built from the shells of plankton too small to see. Across the American plains it gathered into a thick, pale band, the Niobrara chalk, laid down between about 87 and 82 million years ago by an endless, slow rain of those shells sinking through hundreds of feet of water. What it took to make is almost impossible to feel. The rain is so fine and so unhurried that the floor rises by something on the order of a few centimeters in 1,000 years, no faster than that. A band of chalk no thicker than a spread hand can hold 10,000 years of steady, silent falling. The pale bluffs above the Kansas rivers look like ordinary rock, but they are closer to stacks of deep time, set down one invisible grain at a time that a person can walk up to and lay a hand flat against. None of this was peculiar to North America. The same high seas were drowning low ground all across the warming world. Much of Europe had broken into a scatter of islands in a shallow tropical sea, and the chalk of Dover and half a dozen countries was settling onto those drowned floors at the very same time. A long arm of ocean reached across what is now the Sahara. The heart of Africa, too, lay under salt water where there is only sand today. Seen from far above, the Cretaceous Earth would have shown more sea and less land than ours. The continents not just adrift, but half sunk, their lowlands shining with shallow water nearly from pole to pole. A sea that long, reaching from the cold north to the warm tropics, was also a sea of meetings. Chilled water sliding down from the Arctic ran up against warm water pushing north from the Gulf, and where the two mingled, the water turned over and lifted nutrients from below, the engine that feeds plankton, and through them everything else. That is part of why this inland ocean grew so crowded with life. It was two seas, the cold north and the warm south, stirred together down the middle of a continent. And these were not empty waters. Sunlit nearly to the floor in places, and never cold, the western interior seaway was one of the richest seas the world has ever held. At the surface, drifting plankton. Below them, fish in schools beyond counting. Below those, the larger things that lived on the schools. From above, on a bright afternoon, it would have looked like any calm sea anywhere. Blue-green, glittering, gently breathing, stretching peaceful and apparently empty all the way to the edge of sight. But a calm, bright surface is only the lid of a sea. Slip beneath it, down through the warm green light and into the darker water below, and this drowned heart of the continent becomes another place entirely. Some of the largest hunters the ocean has ever carried were down there the whole time, just beneath the glitter, moving through the green dark. Down here, in the green dark below the glitter, the sea is anything but empty. Shapes move at the edge of the light, long and fast and built for hunting. And yet, for all that is here, something is missing. For most of the long age of the dinosaurs, these waters had belonged to one kind of animal above all the rest, the ichthyosaurs, the fish-shaped reptiles. They were built so like dolphins that at a glance they could be mistaken for them. The same smooth spindle body, the same high fin, the same easy speed. They had ruled the open sea for 150 million years. And here, in the late Cretaceous, they are gone. Not rare, gone. This is the first thing the Cretaceous seas have to teach us, and it is a quiet one. When we picture the great dying of this age, we picture the asteroid, the single famous catastrophe at the very end. But the ichthyosaurs never saw it. They had slipped out of the oceans around 94 million years ago, close to 30 million years before that asteroid ever fell. Very nearly half the time that separates the asteroid from us tonight. By the time the sky darkened over the last dinosaurs, the fish lizards were already ancient history. The seas had closed one of their great chapters long before the famous ending, and almost nothing marked the moment. Why they faded is one of those questions the rocks have not fully answered. For 150 million years, the ichthyosaurs had been among the most successful animals in the sea, fast, sharp-eyed, perfectly shaped for open water. Then, over a few million years in the middle of the Cretaceous, they thinned out and stopped. The best reading we have points to a sea in upheaval, a time of fierce warmth, of waters that kept losing their oxygen, of food webs torn up and remade. The ichthyosaurs, by then, were less varied than their ancestors had been, and slower to answer a changing ocean than the newcomers rising around them. And it came on slowly, a first culling, then, some millions of years later, a final quiet exit. But the honest answer is that we do not entirely know. We are reading the end of a whole dynasty from a handful of bones and a silence in the rock. And a silence is a hard thing to explain. Into the space the fish lizards left came something new. And what was new about the rulers of these late Cretaceous seas is how recently they had arrived and what they had been before. They were lizards. Their closest living relatives are the monitor lizards, the same branch of the family as the Komodo dragon. And not long before, in geological terms, their ancestors had been ordinary reptiles walking about on land. In just a few million years, that lizard stock took to the warm, shallow seas, traded legs for paddles, and swelled into the ocean's top predator. The largest, Mosasaurus itself, may have reached anywhere from 11 to 17 meters. The exact length is still argued, with jaws that could close on prey nearly its own size. Another giant, Tyrannosaurus, ran to 13 or 14, and we are still finding their kin. One of the largest of all was recognized only recently, picked out from bones that had lain unstudied in museum drawers for decades, and they had given themselves to the water completely. Warm-blooded enough to hold their own heat, the mosasaurs could range from the tropics into cold northern seas, and they bore their young alive, far from any shore, the newborns slipping straight into open water. No mosasaur ever hauled itself up a beach to lay eggs, the way a sea turtle still must. From the moment it was born to the moment it died, it never once touched dry land. The sea was the only world it would ever know. If you could float for a moment at the surface of that warm sea, the sun warm on your back, the water clear to a good depth, the far shore only a thin line, you might never know what shared it. Then, far below, a shadow as long as a city bus resolves out of the green, a mosasaur cruising, its broad paddles barely moving. It turns one cold eye up toward the light as it passes, and slides on, paying you no mind. It was hunting the schooling fish and the coiled, drifting shells of the deeper water, not anything as small and out of place as a single person treading water at the surface. Newcomers though the mosasaurs were, they shared the water with animals from far older lines. The strangest were the plesiosaurs, a separate tribe of sea reptiles that had been gliding through the oceans since long before the dinosaurs on land grew large. Some were short-necked and quick. One branch, though, had gone in an almost unbelievable direction. It grew the longest necks of any animal before or since. They managed it by piling on extra bones, more and more of them, until a single creature carried 72 in its neck alone, and a close relative carried 76. A giraffe, for comparison, makes do with 7. The neck of one of these animals was longer than a giraffe is tall, trailing ahead of a body the size of a small boat. It was a living fishing rod, drifting low through the schools, the little head taking fish before the rest of the animal had even arrived. And drifting through these seas in their countless millions were the ammonites. Anyone who has picked up a coiled fossil in a souvenir shop, polished and spiraled like a ram's horn, has held one. Relatives of the squid and the octopus, they were soft animals living inside a coiled shell, jetting backward through the water with their arms trailing behind. By the Cretaceous, the ammonites were already one of the oldest success stories on Earth. Their kind had first appeared more than 340 million years earlier, and across all that time they had ridden out one catastrophe after another. That included the worst the world has ever known, the Great Dying at the end of the Permian, which nearly emptied the seas entirely. Whatever the planet had thrown at the oceans, the ammonites had survived it. Some of them even grew strange near the end of all this, uncoiling their shells into corkscrews and tangles and long straight spears, as though the old design were being taken apart and tried a different way. They had outlasted the entire rise of the dinosaurs, and they were, by any fair measure, among the great survivors of all time. There were giants here we might recognize more easily too, sea turtles the size of a small car. One of them, called Archelon, spanned 4 meters from flipper-tip to flipper-tip, paddling these warm shallows long before the sea turtles we know today. But step back from the whole crowded scene, and the real lesson of these seas is not about any single animal. It is about turnover. This ocean was never one settled, unchanging age of marine reptiles. It was a succession, the ichthyosaurs reigning and ending, the mosasaurs arriving late and rising fast to take the empty throne. the plesiosaurs and the ammonites carrying their ancient lines quietly alongside. Whole dynasties of swimming giants rose, ruled their stretch of deep time and slipped away, some of them tens of millions of years before the famous catastrophe we treat as the end of everything. The sea had been closing doors, softly, one after another, the whole time. The ending we remember, the one with a name, was only the last of them. All of this, hunters and hunted, newcomers and ancients, moved through water, in a world that was, just now, more ocean than it had been in a very long age. But the largest animals alive in this whole drowned time were not in the sea at all. To find them, we have to rise back up through the green light, break the surface, and turn toward the land. South, to the broad, warm continents below the equator, where something was crossing the floodplains that made even a 17-meter mosasaur look modest. The true giants of the Cretaceous never swam at all. They walked on dry ground in the warm south, and they were the largest creatures ever to set foot on the earth. Set a grown adult next to one particular fossil, laid out on the floor of a museum hall, and the bone comes up past their shoulder. It is a single vertebra, one bone from the middle of a back, and on its own it stands taller than a person. Step back, and the rest of it begins to assemble. A spine of these, dozens of them, running out to either side, then the four pillar legs, the long sweep of tail, the neck rising and rising toward the roof of the hall. Step back far enough, and what stands there is one of the largest animals ever to have lived. The marvel is that it carried all of that on land, no water to buoy it, no ocean to take the weight, just four legs holding the whole impossible bulk up against gravity. These were the Tyrannosaurs, the last and largest of the sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed, small-headed plant-eaters that had been the giants of the land since the days of the Jurassic. The famous Jurassic ones, the animals most people picture, were already enormous. But it was here in the Cretaceous, and above all in the south, in what is now South America, on the warm fragments of the old southern supercontinent, that a handful of them grew larger than any land animal before or since. Cut off on their own drifting continent, with their own predators and their own pressures, the southern sauropods kept climbing in size, generation after generation, until they reached a place no animal had reached before. Two names get most of the attention. One is Argentinosaurus, the other, found more recently, is Patagotitan, and even saying which of them is bigger turns out to be harder than it sounds. Both were something like 30 to 37 meters from nose to tail tip, and both weighed, by the usual estimates, somewhere between 50 and 75 tons. But look at the width of that range. A spread that wide is less a measurement than a confession. For an animal like Argentinosaurus, we have only a scatter of giant bones, a few vertebrae, part of a leg, a rib, and from those few pieces we are trying to rebuild a whole body, and then guess what it weighed? Different methods, applied by careful people, come out tens of tons apart. Is it even fair to crown a single largest dinosaur when the leading contenders are known from such fragments, and the error bars are heavier than an elephant? The honest answer is that we are standing right at the edge of what the bones can tell us. Set the arithmetic aside, though, and try to feel the size. An animal 35 meters long is roughly 3 city buses parked nose to tail. A weight of 60 or 70 tons is something like 10 or 12 African elephants standing inside one skin. The thigh bone alone could stand taller than a tall man, and a single vertebra, as we saw, comes up past the shoulder. The heart that pushed blood all the way up that neck to that small high head would have been a muscle no person could have lifted. Every part of the animal, taken on its own, is already past the scale of anything alive today. How does an animal get that big and stay alive? Part of the answer, it turns out, is that it was built a little like a bird. The giant's bones were not solid. They were hollowed out and filled with air, lightened from the inside the way a bird's bones are, so the skeleton weighed far less than its size suggests. Air sacs branched back through the body from the lungs, giving these animals a breathing system more efficient than any mammals. It is the same kind of system that lets a goose fly clear over the Himalayas today. The long neck was a feeding machine. It let the animal stand still and graze a wide arc of forest, sweeping that small head across whole stands of conifer and fern without taking a step. They could not chew. They simply stripped the plants and swallowed them whole, to be broken down slowly in a gut the size of a small room. Every part of the body was an answer to the single problem of being enormous. Why did no mammal ever reach this size? Why would the largest land animal alive today, the elephant, have stood only shoulder high to a titanosaur's belly? The deepest reason is the egg. A mammal has to carry its young inside its own body, and there is a hard limit to how large a thing can grow that way. A titanosaur simply laid eggs, dozens at a time, and was never weighed down by a pregnancy at all. Add the bird-like breathing and that tireless way of feeding that never paused to chew, and the result was an engine for growth no mammal has ever come close to matching. Across millions of years, the ceiling on the size of a land animal simply lifted to a height nothing has reached before or since. And the strangest part of all turns the whole scale upside down. Every one of these giants began inside an egg you could have cupped in 2 hands. In a stretch of Patagonian badlands called Auca Mahuevo, the ground holds the remains of a vast titanosaur nursery, thousands upon thousands of eggs, laid in clutches across the floodplain, season after season, by herds returning to the same ground to breed. Some of the eggs still hold their embryos, curled and unhatched, with patches of fossilized skin so fine that the pattern of the scales is still visible. The eggs themselves are about the size of a grapefruit. The hatchling that came out of one was small enough to hold in your palm, and if it lived, it would grow over decades into something 30 meters long and heavier than anything else that has ever walked. A creature could begin small enough to pick up and end large enough that we cannot even weigh it. Not many things in the living world stretch quite that far. A herd of them then, moving across a warm southern floodplain in the late afternoon, not hurrying anywhere, because nothing on earth could make them hurry. Walk in among them and a full-grown one would tower clean over your head. The top of your reach would barely pass its knee. All around would be the moving shade of living things the size of buildings, and the ground would take the slow shock of each footfall a moment before the sound of it arrived. They moved in the unbothered way that only the very large can afford. No predator could bring down a healthy adult. The worst a hunter could manage was to pick off the young or the failing at the edges of the herd. For an animal safe in the middle of all that, the world was a calm and almost weightless place, despite the weight. A long, slow, well-fed afternoon that, for the biggest of them, might have run on for 80 or 100 years. And so the question that has run under all of this comes to rest in the only honest place. These were the largest living things ever to walk the earth, and we cannot say what they weighed to within the mass of an elephant or two. Their size outruns even our arithmetic. We can dig the bones out of the ground, line them along a museum floor, build them again on a screen, and still not put a true figure on the animal. It is simply too big, too long gone, too thinly preserved. There is a kind of quiet that comes with admitting that, not the quiet of failure, since we have learned a great deal, but the quiet of reaching the place where the evidence runs out and the size goes on without us. The largest lives that have ever existed can be approached and circled and wondered at. They cannot quite be held. These long, slow afternoons ran on in the south for tens of millions of years, herds of the largest animals the world has ever made, moving through warm forests near the bottom of the world. But the Cretaceous was a wide age and a many-roomed one. As it wore on toward its final chapters, far to the north and across that inland sea, a very different kind of world was reaching its height. Where the south ran to a handful of titanic giants, the northern continent of Laramidia, the western land we glimpsed from the water, was filling up with crowds. Smaller, busier animals, horned and crested and armoured, in a richer variety than any one place in the Cretaceous had yet held. The giants had the south, the north belonged to the many. Come down to a river floodplain in the west of that northern land, just before sunrise, near the end of the Cretaceous. Mist lies along the water in long pale ribbons, and the air is cool and green-smelling and full of small sounds. Walk a little way into it, and the mist resolves into bodies. A herd of horned dinosaurs, hundreds of them, moving slowly along the river in the half-light, cropping the low plants as they go. The big ones carry shields of bone above their shoulders and horns longer than your arm. The calves keep to the middle of the herd, half hidden among the legs of the adults. You feel the herd before you see all of it, a low, constant tremor coming up through the ground, the weight of many large animals walking. Somewhere a young one bawls and is answered. To the herd, none of this is remarkable. It is just another morning, one of millions. Step back from the herd and take in the wider scene, and the first thing to say is what it is not. It is not a gallery of monsters. What we are looking at in the late Cretaceous of Western North America is one of the richest and most thoroughly studied communities of large animals in the whole fossil record, an ordinary, crowded, working world. In a single stretch of badlands in Alberta, a place now called Dinosaur Provincial Park, the rock holds dozens of dinosaur species piled one upon another, everything from animals the size of a turkey to the great horned grazers. That is the way a modern savanna might look if you drained off the water and pressed the whole living thing flat. This was no planet of a few oversized curiosities standing about in an empty landscape. It was busy, it was full. Start with the animals from the dawn herd, the horned dinosaurs, of which Triceratops is only the most famous. Their trademark was the head. A big Triceratops skull, frill and all, could run close to 2.5 meters long. Among the largest heads ever carried by a land animal, a third of the whole creature's length in solid bone. For a long time we read those horns and frills as armor and weaponry, gear for fending off predators, and they were surely useful for that. But the harder we look, the more the headgear seems to have been aimed at each other. Every kind wore a different arrangement, this one a pair of long brow horns, that one a fan of spikes around the frill, another a single nose horn over a low shield, and that riot of styles reads less like armor than like banners. They were signals, for telling one species from another in a crowd, for sizing up a rival, for winning a mate. A herd of horned dinosaurs was a herd holding up flags. Sharing the plains with them, and far more numerous, were the duck-billed dinosaurs, the great grazing herds of this world, the nearest thing the Cretaceous had to cattle. Part of what let them swarm the floodplains in such numbers was hidden in their mouths. Behind that flat duck bill, each jaw packed hundreds of teeth into a single grinding surface, a living millstone that could chew the toughest, lowest plants around, the kind almost nothing else could process. It made them the great machines for turning vegetation into more dinosaur, and it made them many. Some gathered in herds, thousands strong. In places their bones lie heaped together by the thousand. A whole migrating herd caught at a single river crossing, the way wildebeest still drown by the hundred in the rivers of the Serengeti. And this was a world that made noise. Some of the duckbills carried tall, hollow crests, and the inside of a crest was hollow, a set of looping tubes rather than solid bone. When the animal called through them, the crest worked like a wind instrument, a length of brass coiled on top of the skull. The note it made was low and far-carrying, a foghorn rolling for miles across a flat valley. On a dawn like the one we walked into, those calls would travel back and forth through the mist, herd answering herd, the whole floodplain talking to itself. It is tempting in a museum hall to imagine all these animals as a single fixed cast, Triceratops and the duck-bills and the rest, posed together for all time. They were nothing of the kind. This crowded world ran for something like 15 million years, and across that span, its players were swapped out again and again. The Triceratops we picture belonged only to the very last sliver of the Cretaceous. A few million years earlier, different horned dinosaurs with different frills had grazed these same plains, and a few million years before that, different ones again. We struggle even to count them cleanly. One long-running argument holds that two of our named species are really one animal, young and old. Because the cast kept turning over faster than the rock can always resolve, herd after herd, species after species, the crowd took itself apart and rebuilt itself for 15 million years. That is longer than anything we would recognize as human has walked the earth several times over. And the ordinariness is the staggering part. That a morning like this one, with small changes of cast, kept happening for a stretch of time the mind can barely hold open. And these were animals with families. In Montana, at a site that came to be called Egg Mountain, researchers turned up whole nesting colonies of one kind of duckbill. Dozens of nests stood roughly a body length apart, the way seabirds space themselves along a cliff, each a shallow bowl that had held a clutch of eggs. In and around them lay the bones of babies, some too young to have left the nest, their leg joints not yet finished enough to walk, with worn baby teeth that show they were being fed where they lay. The animal was named Maiasaura, good mother lizard, because the nests told a story few had expected of a dinosaur. Eggs guarded, hatchlings kept close, mouths fed in the nest. These giants had childhoods, they had parents that stayed. Even the heavily armed kept most of their fighting among themselves. The ankylosaurs, low, broad, armored animals built like living tanks, some of them swinging a heavy club of fused bone at the end of the tail, were long assumed to keep that club for predators. But one beautifully preserved ankylosaur, an animal named Zool, came out of the ground with the bony spikes along its flanks, broken and healed in a telling pattern, precisely where the sideways swing of another ankylosaur's tail club would have struck. They had been clubbing each other, settling matters of territory or status, tank against tank. The dome-headed dinosaurs hint at much the same thing. They carried skulls roofed in a thick mound of solid bone, and the best reading is that they drove those domes together the way a ram does, butting heads or flanks in trials of strength. Even the armoured and the bone-skulled, it turns out, kept the oldest social business of all, rank, rivalry, and the question of who gets to breed. Put all of it together, the horned herds with their banners, the duckbills calling across the valley, the nesting colonies, the armoured animals shoving for status. And what stands before us is no horror show and no cabinet of curiosities. It is a living country, crowded, ordinary, and wholly taken up with the business of being alive, eating, calling, raising young, jostling for rank, walking the same river paths morning after morning. There is a particular comfort in that, the same comfort as standing at the edge of any great herd, wildebeest or cattle or reindeer, and feeling for a moment like one warm animal among many, in a world too busy to take much notice. For all its strangeness to us, the late Cretaceous was, most of the time, a calm and crowded and deeply ordinary place to be alive. And yet, a herd is always watching. For all the calm, every animal on that floodplain kept one sense turned outward, toward the tree line, the tall reeds, the places a thing could hide, because a world this thick with grazers is a world that feeds something larger, A crowd of plant eaters on this scale does not graze in peace by accident. It grazes in the shadow of whatever stands above it, big enough to live on the herds themselves. The animals knew it. They could feel at the edge of all that ordinary morning the shape of the thing they spent their lives half listening for. What was it that the whole crowded kingdom watched the shadows for? What the herds watched the shadows for had a name, and it is the most famous name in the whole history of life on Earth. Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant lizard king. It is on lunchboxes and bedsheets and the sides of buses. Almost every child on the planet can name it. And almost everything that child pictures, the way it stood, the way it looked, the way it lived, is, in some particular, wrong. This is the strange thing about the most famous animal that ever lived. We have looked at it longer and harder than at any other extinct creature, and we are still, slowly, learning to see it. Start with the simplest mistake of all, which is a matter of time. We tend to file the tyrant in with the other great dinosaurs, to picture it striding past Stegosaurus and its back plates, or in among the long-necked giants of the older world. But it never saw any of them. Tyrannosaurus lived right at the very end of the Cretaceous, in the last 2 million years before the asteroid, around 66 to 68 million years ago. Stegosaurus had already been gone for something like 80 million years by the time the first Tyrant hatched. Put it plainly, Tyrannosaurus is closer in time to you, awake and reading this tonight, than it ever was to Stegosaurus. The gap behind it, back to the creatures we so casually file it with, is wider than the whole gap that runs forward to us. Now look at the animal itself, beginning with the face, because the face is where the familiar picture fails first. We imagine a mouth crowded with bare, exposed daggers, the permanent snarling grin of every model and every film. But teeth do badly in open air. Left uncovered, enamel dries and splits. The stronger evidence now points to lips, scaly reptilian lips, much like a monitor lizard's, that closed over the teeth and kept them sealed and sound whenever the mouth was shut. That grin is a Hollywood invention. The living tyrant kept its weapons covered the way most predators do. The skin is the next surprise, and here we have contrived to be wrong in both directions at once. For most of the last century, the tyrant was drawn as a bare, scaly reptile. Then the feathered dinosaurs of China turned up, and the picture flipped. If the smaller cousins wore feathers, surely the king did too, and for a while it grew fashionable to imagine the whole animal under a coat of shaggy down. Reality seems to sit in between. Its lineage was, far back, a feathered one, and some of its relatives were certainly clothed in it. But the patches of real Tyrannosaurus skin we have recovered are scaly, pebbled like a lizard's, with no trace of feathers at all. A very large body makes and keeps a great deal of heat, and like an elephant beside a mouse, it can afford to go mostly bare. The grown tyrant was, most likely, a scaly animal descended from feathered ancestors, neither the naked monster nor the giant chick. And then there are the arms. They really were small, almost comically so for a body that size, too short even to reach the mouth. But they were not the withered, useless things of the cartoons. The bones are thick, the muscle scars deep, marking arms that could pull with real force. What that force was for, pinning struggling prey, gripping a mate, levering the great body up off the ground, we honestly do not know. The most mocked limbs in natural history are also still among the least understood. And it was no slow, dim-witted brute either. That old image of a sluggish, stupid reptile dragging its tail has not survived a close look at the skull. Inside that skull, the region given over to smell was enormous. This was an animal that read the world mainly through its nose, able to catch the scent of a carcass or a living herd across miles of open country. Its eyes faced forward, giving it the overlapping, depth-judging gaze of a hawk or a wolf rather than the sideways glance of a grazer. Stand at its eye level, and you would have to climb to do it. A grown tyrant looked out on the world from the height of a second-story window. The gaze you met there belonged to something fast, sharp-sensed, and wholly capable. It hunted and it scavenged as the day allowed. An old argument over whether the tyrant was really a hunter or really a scavenger has quietly settled into the obvious answer: both, the way a lion is both. And whatever it closed its jaws on, it bit down with one of the most powerful bites any land animal has ever produced, strong enough to crush fresh bone to splinters. We are not guessing. Among the fossils are droppings packed solid with the pulverized bone of what these animals had eaten. For all the attention lavished on it, the basic accounting is still unsettled, and that too belongs in an honest portrait. A few years ago, a careful study proposed splitting Tyrannosaurus into 3 species: a king, a queen, and an emperor in effect, sorted by build and by the front teeth. Most of the field looked at the same bones and disagreed. One species, naturally variable the way any crowd is variable, was enough, and one species it has stayed. A thornier case surrounds a smaller, lighter, sharper-toothed tyrannosaur, long known and long disputed, sometimes given a name of its own: Nanotyrannus, the little tyrant. For years it was filed as a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, not yet grown into its bulk. But recent work has prized even that open again, reading growth rings in the bone that look more like a small adult than a fast-growing youngster. The question is genuinely alive once more. With the most studied dinosaur on Earth, we are still not certain how many kinds of it we hold. What we do know in vivid detail is how one of these animals lived a life. The tyrant grew up fast and hard. For its first years, it was a lean, fleet, long-legged thing. Then, as a teenager, it hit a growth spurt so violent it could pack on close to 1,000 kilograms in a single year, swelling from greyhound to battering ram in little more than a decade. The famous skeletons carry names. Sue, the largest and most complete, lived into her late 20s, and her bones read like a record of a hard life. Healed ribs, a damaged arm, infection in the jaw. She was an old, scarred animal that had survived a great deal before the end. Scotty, a touch larger still, is the oldest we have found and may have reached 30. And there were a great many of them. One careful estimate puts the number of Tyrannosaurus that ever lived across the whole life of the species at around 2.5 billion. A figure so uncertain it could be 10 times smaller or 10 times larger, but billions regardless. Out of all those billions, we have found a few dozen good skeletons. Everyone we lift from the rock stands in for tens of millions of animals that lived and hunted and vanished without leaving a trace. Set all these corrections side by side, and a surprising thing happens. With each myth stripped away, the real animal comes more sharply into focus. The lipped, keen-nosed, scaly but feather-descended, fast-growing, sharp-eyed creature the evidence keeps assembling is harder to fit on a lunchbox than the roaring monster ever was, and far more real. There is a particular tenderness in that, the feeling of finally meeting someone we were sure we knew, and finding they were always more than the cartoon. Behind the most overused image in the history of life, there was a real animal, with a childhood, a keen nose, a handful of years, at the hard daily work of staying alive at the top of a crowded world. We spent a century turning it into a monster. The bones keep turning it back into an animal. For all that power, though, the tyrant was bound to the ground. It ruled the land at the end of the Cretaceous as completely as anything has ever ruled anything. But the land was only the floor of this world. Lift the eye from the herds and the hunter, up past the treetops and the high warm haze of the afternoon, And there was another kingdom overhead, ruled by animals built on a wholly different plan. Some of them were the size of small aircraft, and when one of them unfolded, leaned into the wind and stepped off a rise into the air, the largest creature ever to fly left the ground. The largest animal ever to take to the air had a wingspan of around 10 or 11 meters, roughly the width of a small aircraft. And when it folded those wings and came down to stand on the ground, it looked out at the world from the height of a giraffe. It was not a bird. It was not a dinosaur. And it was entirely real. It strode across these same Cretaceous floodplains, among the herds and the hunters, and then it opened those wings and flew. These were the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, and they are among the most misunderstood animals in this whole story. They were not feathered dinosaurs like the ones we met in the lakebeds of China, and they were not early birds either. They belonged to a wholly separate branch of the reptile family, a lineage that had invented flight entirely on its own account, long before the first bird ever opened a wing. The pterosaurs were, in fact, the first creatures with backbones ever to fly. They had been crossing the skies of the world for 150 million years before this Cretaceous moment. And they flew on a wing no bird or bat would recognize. It was a single sheet of skin and muscle stretched along one enormously elongated finger. The whole wing carried, in effect, on one impossibly long finger reaching back toward the ankle. The greatest of them came at the very end, here in the late Cretaceous. The largest we know was named Quetzalcoatlus, after an Aztec god, a feathered serpent that flew between the earth and the sky, which is about as fitting a name as anyone has managed for an extinct animal. Standing, it came up to perhaps 3.5 meters at the shoulder, with its head held higher still, so that it could indeed have looked a giraffe levelly in the eye. We have to be honest that we do not have all of it. The biggest individuals are known mostly from fragments, and the full dimensions are scaled up from smaller, better preserved relatives. But the giant was no fluke. On one Cretaceous island, a stockier, heavier-built cousin with a massive head and thick-walled bones stalked about as the island's top predator, a flying reptile that hunted on foot. These were the largest flying animals that have ever existed, before or since. How any of this could fly comes down to how it was built. A pterosaur's bones were hollow, air-filled, walled in places no thicker than the shell of an egg, and braced on the inside with a lattice of fine struts, the very trick engineers would later use to keep an aircraft wing both light and strong. A giant with a 10-meter wingspan might have weighed only as much as a large deer, astonishingly little for an animal that size. The whole creature was a structure for turning as little material as possible into as much wing as possible. Strength without weight, carried to a limit nothing else has matched. How much such an animal weighed is, even so, one of those questions with no settled answer. Estimates run from 70 kilograms to over 500, depending on how the body is reconstructed, and no one is sure. What has changed, and recently, is the picture of how it lived. For a long time, the giants were imagined far out over the open ocean, gliding low and skimming fish from the surface with their beaks. The newer reading is stranger and built on a closer study of the whole body. These were animals of the land. Picture a stork the size of a giraffe, striding across the floodplains, walking on all fours, the long wing fingers folded up out of the way like furled umbrellas. It lowered that great head to pluck up lizards, baby dinosaurs, anything small enough to swallow whole. The largest flyer in the history of the world spent much of its life on foot, hunting like a heron grown to the size of a giraffe. But how does something that big get off the ground in the first place? A bird launches by running or by springing off its hind legs, but no two-legged leap could throw a quarter-ton animal into the air. The answer the giants seem to have used is one of the strangest pieces of engineering in the whole fossil record. They launched on all fours, crouching low, then driving down hard with those massive forelimbs, the same arms that carried the wings, and vaulting up and forward like a pole vaulter clearing the bar. In a single explosive movement, an animal heavier than a grown man could throw itself 2.5 meters into the air, and only then, at the top of the vault, snap the wings open and begin to fly. Stand under one as it happens, and you would feel the downdraft and the shadow before you quite understood what you were seeing. A giraffe-sized creature would leave the ground in a single bound and climb into the sky on wings as wide as a fighter jet's. You would crane your neck and lose it against the sun. Once up, the picture changes entirely. On the ground, these were heavy, careful animals. In the air, they became something else entirely. Superb, efficient soarers, holding those vast wings out stiff and letting the rising warm air carry them, the way an albatross or a condor rides the wind today with barely a wing beat. And the wing itself was no dead sail. It was a living membrane, threaded with muscle and fine stiffening fibers, and laced with blood vessels that the animal could tense and curve and trim like a sail handler working canvas. A wing it could feel. A body that seems impossible standing in a museum makes perfect sense once it is aloft and gliding. Some of these giants may have crossed hundreds of miles, even whole seas, riding from one column of warm air to the next. For all their size, they would have moved across the sky with the slow, unhurried grace of the very large. If you saw one pass high overhead, you might need a moment to register that it was alive at all and not some strange aircraft drifting over the land. Not all the pterosaurs of this world were giants on foot. An earlier and more familiar kind, Pteranodon, was a creature of that inland sea we sailed across earlier, a toothless, crested flyer wheeling over the warm water and snatching fish near the surface, the Cretaceous answer to an albatross or a gannet. The males were large and carried tall, backward sweeping crests on their skulls. The females were smaller and far more common, 2 of them for every male. It is one of the small intimacies the fossils give us, not just the shape of an animal, but a hint of how its sexes differed, who was rarer, who wore the showier head. There is one more thing to hold about these giants, and it is the kind of fact deep time keeps handing us. The pterosaurs had been flying for 150 million years. They had taken nearly every shape a flyer can take, sparrow small to fish-eating to these giraffe-sized stalkers. And the very largest of them, the largest creatures ever to leave the ground, did not appear at the dawn of all that in the lineage's first flush. They appeared at its very end, at the dusk of the pterosaurs in the last stretch of the Cretaceous, peak flight reached just before the curtain. Whether their kind was already thinning by then or still as varied as ever is something specialists still argue over. The most recent finds hint they may have been doing better right to the end than we once believed. But either way, the giants came last. The most extraordinary flyers the world has ever produced were also among the final ones, gliding over a world with far less time left than any of them could know. Follow one of them then, as it lifts off the warm southern floodplain and climbs into the afternoon, up and up, until the herds below are specks and the inland sea is a band of bright haze on the horizon. A flyer like this could go almost anywhere the wind allowed. And if we follow this one as it turns and beats slowly northward toward the top of the world, it carries us out of the warm and crowded heart of the Cretaceous, on toward the high latitudes, where the continents thinned and the light itself began to fail, into one of the strangest corners of this whole world. For 4 months of the year, here at the top of the world, the sun does not rise at all. Stand in this forest in the depth of that winter, and there is no dawn to wait for. only a long blue-black dusk that never quite becomes day. The stars wheeling overhead, the trees bare and still, the ground hard underfoot. It is about as far from the warm, crowded floodplains we have been walking as anywhere in the Cretaceous gets. And yet you are not alone in the dark. Somewhere off among the black trunks, something large is moving. You hear it before you see anything. The crack of a branch, the slow shift of weight, a breath. A dinosaur is out there in the polar night, and it lives here. It did not leave for the winter. This is its home. What makes this corner of the Cretaceous so strange is that the darkness had nothing to do with the cold. We have spent this whole journey in a hothouse world, a world with no polar ice caps, warm almost from pole to pole. And all of that was still true here. But warmth does not buy back the sun. How much daylight a place gets depends only on where it sits on the turning, tilted Earth, and this land sat very far north indeed, around 80 degrees of latitude, deep inside what we would now call the Arctic. So for months, each winter, the sun simply slid below the horizon and stayed there, warm world or not. The forests at this latitude were no frozen wastes. They were cool, damp woods of deciduous conifers and ferns, a little like the Pacific Northwest today. But every autumn, the light drained away, the trees let go of their needles and leaves, and the whole forest settled into a long, dim, dormant dark. And the year did not only swing into darkness, it swung just as hard the other way. At a latitude like this, midsummer brings the opposite extreme. Weeks on end when the sun never sets at all, circling low around the sky through what should be the middle of the night. Under that endless light, the dormant forest woke and ran riot, growing fast and green and rich while it could. The polar year was a year of extremes, a furious, sleepless summer of growth banked against a long, starving dark. Whatever let the dinosaurs survive the winter was very likely paid for in the wild abundance of those bright, endless summer months. For a long time, the natural assumption was that any dinosaurs found this far north must have been visitors. Great herds, the thinking went, that walked up from the warm south for the bright summer and back again before the dark closed in, the way caribou and geese still move with the seasons. It is a sensible idea. It also seems to be wrong. In the rocks of northern Alaska, a formation called Prince Creek, researchers have found not just the bones of adults, but the bones of the very young. Tiny teeth, the fragile bones of hatchlings, even traces of animals still inside the egg. These traces are barely the size of grains of rice, sieved by hand from frozen riverbank sediment over many long field seasons, which is part of why the truth took so long to surface. But there it was. You do not leave your unhatched eggs and your newborns somewhere you are only passing through. These dinosaurs were not summer tourists. They were nesting here at the top of the world, raising their young through the whole cycle of the polar year, which means they stayed for the winter, in the dark, generation after generation. The animals themselves were, for the most part, familiar, polar editions of the kinds we have already met. Duck-billed herds grazed these northern forests. Horned dinosaurs moved among them. Small, big-eyed hunters worked the long twilight, their eyes perhaps tuned to a world that stayed dim for much of the year. And stalking all of them was a tyrant, but a smaller one than the giant of the south, a dwarfed polar cousin we have named Narrator, the polar bear lizard. It may be that the leaner pickings of a land locked in darkness a third of the year simply could not feed a full-sized king. The top hunter of the Arctic Cretaceous was a scaled-down version of the one we met on the warm plains. Everything here was a variation on the world we already know, adjusted, shrunk or sharpened to survive at its cold, dark edge. And here the honest part of the story begins, because we still do not really understand how they did it. How does a dinosaur get through 4 months of cold and darkness, with the forest stripped bare and almost nothing to eat? We can see that they managed it. We cannot fully say how. Each leading idea explains a piece, and none of them explains the whole. The strongest single clue is the nesting itself. Animals that breed and raise young through a polar winter are almost certainly not sluggish, cold-blooded reptiles waiting out the season, but warm-bodied creatures making their own heat and staying active in the dark. Perhaps the plant-eaters browsed dead twigs and bark, and whatever stayed green through the dark. The big-eyed hunters, maybe, did well in a place where seeing in the dark was the most useful thing an animal could do. A few have even wondered about brief spells of torpor, a light hibernation. But that evidence is thin. Put plainly, a whole community of animals lived through a season that, by rights, should have killed it, and the full account of how is still missing. And they did it every year, on schedule, for millions of years. This is the part that is easy to say and almost impossible to truly feel. The long polar night was no one-off ordeal that a few hardy animals happened to survive. It returned every single winter for as long as these forests stood, and these forests stood for millions of years. Generation after generation of dinosaur hatched into that returning dark, grew up knowing the 4-month night the way we know summer and winter, and lived out a whole life on a world that, at this latitude, went black for a third of every year. A nursery was kept running at the top of the planet through a darkness that came back 1,000,000 times. Picture it from above, a forest of browsing, breathing dinosaurs under a sky with no sun in it, lit instead, some nights, by the slow green curtains of an aurora. A polar night as long as a season of human grief and life simply going on inside it, calm and used to the dark. And it was not the only place this happened. At the far other end of the Earth, in what is now southern Australia, pulled down close to the South Pole back then, dinosaurs lived through the same long darkness in forests that may have been colder still. Both ends of this warm world had their people of the dark. How cold it actually got is still argued. The textbook picture is of poles with no permanent ice at all, and that is probably right. No great sheets, no year-round glaciers, but some chemical traces in the rocks have been read as hints of brief seasonal ice, even in this hothouse age, which would mean snow and hard freezes settling over these forests through the long night, then melting away each spring. If so, then these dinosaurs were not only living in the dark. Some winters, they were living in the snow. Either way, what these polar worlds leave us with is a particular kind of wonder, quieter than the giants and the tyrants, and stranger. It is the image of a clutch of eggs, kept warm by the body of a parent, in a forest at the top of a black and frozen world, waiting out a night that will not break until spring. Life had pushed all the way out to the edge of what the planet would allow, and made a home there, in the dark, where by every reasonable expectation it should not have managed to live at all. Stand once more in that dark forest, but this time, instead of looking up at the great shapes moving between the trees, look down. Down at the frozen leaf litter, at the burrows tucked under the roots, at the warm gaps beneath fallen logs. The dinosaurs, though, were never the whole of this world. Up to now, the story has belonged to the large, the herds, the tyrants, the giants, the great wings. But the future of this world was not being written by any of them. It was being written quietly, close to the ground, by small warm creatures we had been stepping over all along. While all of this walked overhead, the herds and the horned giants, the tyrant, the great wings, the long polar nights, what was living underneath it? The answer is a whole second world, one we have been walking over this entire time without quite stopping to look at it. Down among the roots and the leaf litter, in the burrows and the hollow logs, in the low branches and the dark, there lived a great variety of small, warm, furred animals, the mammals. They were not waiting their turn. They were already here, and had been here for a very long time. This is the first thing the textbooks of a generation ago tended to get wrong, and it matters more than it sounds. We were taught a tidy story. First came the long age of reptiles, with the dinosaurs ruling everything, and then, only once they were gone, the age of mammals, our own kind finally stepping out of the shadows to take its turn. It is a satisfying story. It is also false, in a way that quietly rewrites where we come from. The mammals did not arrive after the dinosaurs. The two lineages are almost exactly the same age. Both first appeared back in the Triassic, before the dinosaurs had even grown large, and from that point on, they ran side by side. For the whole reign of the dinosaurs, the entire 150 million years of it, our ancestors were there too, living small and low. They were not waiting in the wings for the giants to leave. They were already on the stage, down in the understory, for the length of the whole play. And they were not the dull, identical little things the old story imagined either. A single kind of timid, shrew-sized insect eater, all alike, all hiding. The mammals of the Cretaceous were a real crowd in miniature. Some climbed in the trees, some dug and lived underground. One had webbed feet and a flat, scaly tail and swam like a tiny beaver. Another glided between branches on a flap of skin the way a flying squirrel does today. Some ate insects, yes, but others ate plants or seeds or fungus or one another. In the shadow of the dinosaurs, the mammals had quietly worked out most of the ways there are to make a living as a small animal. The understory was not a waiting room. It was a thriving, complicated little world of its own. The most successful of all of them is one most people have never heard of. They were small, rodent-like animals called multituberculates, gnawing, seed and nut eaters with chisel teeth, filling the role that squirrels and mice and rats fill today, tens of millions of years before any true rodent existed. They were everywhere. In many late Cretaceous communities of the north, more than half of all the mammals were these little gnawers. And they were astonishingly durable. As a group, they would last, in the end, for well over 100 million years, longer than any other order of mammals before or since, outliving even the dinosaurs before the true rodents at last edged them out. Among the others were the early relatives of today's marsupials and of the placentals. One of the loveliest of these was a small insect eater called Eomaya, dug out of those same Chinese lakebeds that gave us the feathered dinosaurs. It was preserved so finely that the faint shadow of its fur is still in the rock, 125 million years on. And the timing of all this was no accident. As the flowering plants spread through the Cretaceous, they laid out a new feast, seeds, fruits, and a richer crop of insects feeding on all of it. And the small mammals diversified to take advantage of it, the gnawers and the seed-eaters multiplying alongside the blossom. The quiet revolution of the flowers and the quiet radiation of the mammals were, in part, the same story. And they were not all small enough to fear everything around them. The most startling was an animal called Rhipenomammus, not a giant but badger-sized, which for a mammal of this age was huge. And we know what at least one of them ate, because a fossil turned up with its last meal still inside its ribcage, the broken bones of a young plant-eating dinosaur. Here was a mammal that hunted dinosaurs, or at least ate their young. It turns the old story of cowering mammals and lordly reptiles neatly on its head. There is an even more dramatic fossil, reported more recently, that appears to show one of these badger-sized mammals locked in combat with a dinosaur several times its size, the two tangled together at the instant of death. That one is genuinely disputed. Some specialists suspect the specimen is not all it appears, so it is best held lightly. But the simpler evidence, the dinosaur bones in the stomach, is rock solid, and it is startling enough on its own. Down in the shadow world beneath the giants, Some of the small warm things were predators in their own right. Most of these mammals lived by night, and that too has left its mark on us. The simplest way for a small, warm-blooded animal to stay clear of the daytime dinosaurs was to come out after dark. And for well over 100 million years, that is largely what mammals did. They became creatures of the night, keen-nosed, sharp-eared, whisker-sensitive, but not much use with color, since color vision is wasted in the dark. Over those long nocturnal ages, the mammal eye quietly let go of 2 of the 4 color receptors its distant ancestors had carried. We never got them back. To this day, most mammals are red-green colorblind, seeing the world in a muted 2-tone palette, and the reason a dog or a horse cannot tell red from green is that its ancestors spent the whole age of dinosaurs in the dark. Our own ape line later re-evolved a 3rd receptor, which is why we see in richer color than most of our kind, but even that is a late patch over an ancient loss. The long night of the dinosaurs is written into the very eyes you see the world with. And somewhere in this small, busy, nocturnal crowd was us, or rather the thing we would come from. The placental mammals, the great branch that includes mice and whales and bats and elephants and us, trace back to a single small ancestor. The best recent evidence places that ancestor right here in the late Cretaceous, which means the founder of our whole branch, one of your own ancestors at an unimaginable remove, was very likely a small, furred, probably nocturnal creature that shared its world with Tyrannosaurus itself. Our deep family does not begin after the dinosaurs, in some fresh new dawn. It begins down here, in the dark and the leaf litter, under their feet. A small, warm animal keeping low, getting by, raising its young in the gaps for 150 million years, with no idea that everything still to come, including you, was riding on it. There is a quiet, conspiratorial fondness in looking at these creatures, the overlooked, the small, the ones nobody paints on the museum mural. We root for them, and not only because they are sweet. We root for them because we know, as they could not, how the long story turns out, that the meek, in the most literal sense there is, were keeping the future safe in the dark. Everything we have just looked at, the gnawing little survivors, the badger that ate dinosaurs, the small ancestor of us all, the eyes still tuned to a vanished dark, comes to us from rocks 100 million years old and more. But none of it arrived explained. The Understory left no note explaining itself. Every piece of this had to be found, freed from the rock and slowly understood, and that work is recent, almost startlingly so. So before we follow this world toward its ending, we should leave deep time for a while. It is time to step into the near past, the last 2 centuries, and the strange, stubborn, error-strewn human story of how we first learned to read the stone at all. In the chalk under a hill near the Dutch city of Maastricht, sometime in the 1770s, quarrymen cutting stone struck bone. What they worked free was a set of fanged jaws, over 1 meter long, locked in the white rock. Nobody knew what it was. A crocodile, some said. A whale, said others. The teeth belonged to no animal anyone could name. In time, the great skull made its way to Paris, carried off, the story goes, as a prize of war when French troops took the city. There it came under the eye of Georges Cuvier, the most formidable anatomist of the age. Cuvier studied the jaws and reached a conclusion that in his day came close to heresy. This was no living animal. It was a giant sea lizard, unlike anything alive then or since, and it was gone from the earth entirely. It is hard now to feel how strange that idea was. For most of human history, people assumed the living world was complete and permanent, a finished work in which nothing could simply be lost. A well-made world did not misplace its creatures. Cuvier's giant lizard, along with his studies of mammoth bones, broke that assumption open. Here was proof that whole kinds of animal had once existed and then ceased to be, that the Earth had a history, and that its history included endings. Nearly everything in the story we have been following, the lost worlds, the vanished giants, the very idea that the past was a different place, begins with that recognition. And there is a quiet fitness to where it began. The notion that life can end was born, of all things, from an animal of the Cretaceous, the one period whose own ending would become the most famous of all. Once that door was open, the mistakes came thick and fast, and the mistakes, it turns out, are half the story. In the 1820s, an English country doctor named Gideon Mantell began finding huge, worn plant-eaters' teeth in Cretaceous rock, the remains of one of the first dinosaurs ever recognized, which he named Iguanodon. The story usually told is that his wife, Mary Ann, found the first tooth by a roadside while he visited a patient. The truth is murkier, and Mantell told it more than one way himself. Reconstructing the animal from scraps, he found a single spike of bone and, reasonably enough, set it on the creature's nose, like a rhinoceros horn. It stayed there on model after model for nearly 50 years, until better skeletons revealed that the horn was really a spike on the animal's thumb. When the first life-size dinosaurs were built for the public in the gardens of London's Crystal Palace, they came out as heavy, scaly, four-footed beasts, something between a lizard and an elephant. Almost every detail was wrong. They are still standing there today, charming and mistaken, a monument to a confident first guess. These creatures did not even have a name until 1842. The English anatomist Richard Owen, gathering the scattered finds together, coined a word for them: dinosaur, from the Greek for terrible lizard. The word dinosaur is younger than the United States. For the whole of human history before the 1840s, every empire, every cathedral, every story ever told around a fire, people walked over the bones of these animals with no name for them and no idea what they were. Some of them perhaps crossed the very ground beneath your feet. And the picture we carry now, the feathered, warm-blooded, bird-related animals we have been watching, is younger still, mostly a matter of the last 50 years. You did not inherit the first guess about any of this. You inherited the latest correction, and there will be more. The errors were not confined to amateurs and first attempts. Some of the most spectacular belong to the experts. In 1868, the brilliant and headlong American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope described a long-necked marine reptile, an elasmosaur, and in his hurry made one of the most famous blunders in the whole science. He put the skull on the wrong end, mounting that small head at the tip of the long tail. A rival anatomist, Joseph Leidy, quietly pointed out that the neck and tail had been reversed. Cope is said to have tried to buy up every copy of the journal that carried the mistake, though that part may be a later embellishment. What is certain is the feud it helped fuel, a long, bitter rivalry between Cope and his great competitor, Othniel Marsh, in which the two raced across the American West, naming dinosaurs faster than they could properly study them, neither above wrecking the other's digs. Between them, in all that haste, they did enormous damage and enormous good. And the people who did this work were often as colourful as the animals. The first Tyrannosaurus rex was hauled out of the Badlands of Montana in 1902 by a collector named Barnum Brown, christened, as it happens, after the great showman P.T. Barnum, and every bit as theatrical as the name promised. Brown worked the dry Badlands in a full-length fur coat, blasted away tons of rock with dynamite to reach the bones beneath, and in later life quietly moonlighted as a spy. His colleagues called him Mr. Bones. There is a real romance to that early fieldwork, but underneath it was patient, back-breaking, often thankless labour, the slow freeing of a single skeleton over weeks and months. Every great dinosaur looming over a museum hall is the visible end of that hidden, dusty, enormous effort. Some corrections take a long time to arrive, and one of them is almost a parable. In the 1920s, an American expedition led by Roy Chapman Andrews crossed the Gobi Desert of Mongolia by motorcar and at a place they called the Flaming Cliffs for the way the bare red sandstone burns at sunset, they found the first dinosaur eggs science had ever recognized. Andrews himself, with his wide hat and his pistol and his appetite for danger, is often said to have been the model for a certain movie adventurer, though no filmmaker ever admitted it. Near one clutch of those eggs lay a small dinosaur, and the team drew the obvious conclusion: it had died raiding the nest. They named it Oviraptor, egg thief, and the name stuck for 70 years. Then, decades later, another expedition found the same kind of egg with an unhatched oviraptor curled inside it. Those eggs were not stolen, they were its own. The thief had died not robbing the nest, but guarding it, sheltering its eggs the way a bird shelters a clutch, killed in the act of being a parent. A paper that finally set the record straight carried with some feeling the title "An Egg Thief Exonerated." This is how the whole picture got built, not handed down complete but assembled slowly by fallible people, one corrected mistake at a time. Every confident number in this story was once a guess. Every clean skeleton was once a muddle of misplaced bones. Every fact was, at some point, somebody's life's work, and very often somebody's error first. There is something moving in that, once it is noticed. Behind each polished display case stands a long line of people: quarrymen and country doctors, rivals and obsessives, men in fur coats and women whose names the records half forgot, each of whom spent a life bent over stone, getting it wrong, and then, slowly, getting it less wrong. The science of the deep past is not a list of facts handed down from on high. It is a human achievement, and a humble one. The long, patient correction of our own first impressions of a world none of us will ever see. And it was that same patient reading of the rock that turned up in the end the most important clue of all. In the 1970s, a geologist named Walter Alvarez was studying a gorge in the hills of central Italy, near the old town of Gubbio, where the layered rock runs smoothly up through the very end of the Cretaceous. The boundary was plain to see. Below it lay pale limestone full of the shells of tiny sea creatures. Above it, rock nearly swept clean of them, and between the two, a thin seam of grey clay, barely a centimetre thick. Something had happened in the sliver of time that centimetre held, something that emptied the seas almost overnight. Working with his father, the physicist Luis Alvarez, he tested the clay and found it strangely rich in iridium, a metal scarce in the Earth's crust but common in the stuff of asteroids and comets. The thing that had emptied the seas, the evidence said, had come from the sky. That single thin line of clay was not a record of how the Cretaceous lived. It was the first hard evidence of how it died. And to read that day properly, we have to go back into deep time one last time, to the warm and ordinary world that lay beneath the clay, the last unsuspecting age before the sky fell in on it. Pull far enough back and the last stretch of the Cretaceous looks like a long, slow exhale. The fierce heat of the middle of the period had peaked tens of millions of years before. Ever since, the world had been cooling very gently by a few degrees, easing off its highest setting over an immense stretch of time. From that distance, it could almost look like a world winding down, but come down out of that long view, down through the millions of years, the drifting continents, the shifting seas, down to a single morning in a single forest near the end of it all. And there is nothing of the kind to see. There is only an ordinary day. The light comes up grey and then gold through the conifers and the flowering trees. A mist lifts off a river. Somewhere a herd is already moving, and the small things in the leaf litter are awake. Nothing anywhere in this forest seems wrong. That slow cooling was real, and it is the gentleness of it that matters most. A few degrees, spread across millions of years, is a change so faint that no animal alive could ever have felt it. No generation of dinosaurs woke to a colder world than the one its parents had known. The difference from one lifetime to the next was nothing at all, far below anything a living body could register. The cooling shows up only in the chemistry of the rocks, read across spans of time longer than our whole species has existed. From inside that world, there was no sense of an ending on the way, no gathering chill, no long shadow falling. There was only the ordinary weather of a slightly cooler age, going on the way it always had. There was one disturbance, though, and it was far away. On the other side of the world, in what is now Western India, the ground had cracked open and begun to bleed. Enormous outpourings of lava, eruptions on a scale the modern world has never witnessed, were building a vast plateau of black rock, layer on layer. And with the lava came gas, carbon dioxide and sulfur, breathed into the sky across thousands of years. These eruptions, the Deccan Traps, were the kind of event that can unsettle a whole planet's climate, nudging it warmer, then cooler, in long, uneven swings. They had begun before the end, and they would still be erupting at the end and after it. Just how hard they strained the living world and exactly when is something specialists still work out and argue over. But the world had taken on a kind of background stress, a slow, deep disturbance, building far from the quiet forests that none of the animals could ever have connected to anything. And there is a deeper question hanging over these last few million years, one we genuinely cannot settle. Were the dinosaurs already in trouble before anything fell from the sky? Some studies, reading the fossil record carefully, find a long, slow fade, dinosaur variety they argue, gently dropping for something like 10 million years before the end. The cause, perhaps, was the cooling, or the duck-billed herds crowding the other plant-eaters out. Other researchers look at the very same record and see no such thing. What looks like a fade, they say, is only the patchiness of fossilization, the plain fact that some ages leave more rock and more bones than others, fooling us into reading a decline that was never there. It is a hard question, because the evidence is thin and easily misread, and careful people come down on both sides. And it matters more than it might seem. If the dinosaurs were already fading, then the asteroid merely finished a story that was winding down on its own. If they were not, if they were as varied and successful as ever, then it did not end a dying world. It interrupted a thriving one. It is, in the end, the difference between a death and a killing. Is it fair then to call this a world in decline, or only a world about to be cut off in full stride? We do not know, and the honest answer sits, uneasily, somewhere between the two. Whatever the deeper answer, the surface of that last world gave nothing away. In the very youngest Cretaceous rocks, the ones laid down in the final stretch before the boundary clay, the world is still crowded and green and full. The great Tyrant still hunts there. The horned giants and the duck-billed herds still move across the floodplains. The small mammals still keep to their burrows. The flowers still open every spring. If anything was thinning, it was thinning so slowly against such abundance that no one walking through that forest could have seen it. The last age of the dinosaurs did not look like a last age. It looked like the middle of something, like a world with all the time in the world. Picture it, then, not as data, but as a place. A Triceratops calf, days old, keeping close to the legs of the herd as it crops the ferns. The slow drip of resin down a conifer trunk. A flower opening to the morning sun and a small bee working it over. The Tyrant resting in the shade through the heat of the day. a fly walking on its eyelid, rain coming in the afternoon, the way it always does. None of it is rare. All of it is about to be gone. And this is the ache of standing where we stand. We have read the clay. We know what that thin grey line means, that somewhere far out beyond the edge of the sky, on a path it had been travelling for millions of years, a mountain of rock was already falling toward this exact world. The forest does not know. Stand in that golden ordinary morning, the mist on the river, the herd moving off, the tyrant somewhere among the trees, the small warm mammal asleep in its burrow. And you are carrying something none of them can. You know how this morning ends. You know what is already on its way. They do not, and they cannot. We cannot warn them. We cannot reach back across 66 million years to tell a single one of them what is coming. There is no sign in the sky they could read, no shadow yet, no warning of any kind. Every living thing in that forest has, at the very most, a few centuries left, many of them only years. And not one of them has any idea that the number of its mornings has very nearly run out. There is something almost unbearable in an ordinary morning seen this way, in caring about a world precisely because it does not know it is about to end. These were the last good days, and there was nothing remarkable about them, only more grazing, more hunting, more nesting, more flowering. The long Cretaceous afternoon ran on as it always had, measured out now in its final geological inches. The world had no way to brace itself. It had no idea anything was coming, and so it simply went on living that last ordinary morning the way it had lived every morning for tens of millions of years before. And then, on a single day we can now almost put a date to, the sky did what the clay remembers. The long summer of the Cretaceous ended, not over millions of patient years, the way everything in it had always changed, but in the space of a single afternoon. That world did not know what was coming. We do, and so there is only one thing left to ask. What came? It came on an ordinary morning in spring. We know that much, and it is one of the strangest, most intimate facts in this whole story. Of all the countless mornings of the Cretaceous, across all those tens of millions of years, this is the single morning whose season we can name. The clue is in the bones of fish that died that day, in the growth patterns laid down in them as the seasons turned. It was the northern spring, the year waking up, the season of hatching and new green. There is a particular poignancy in that the worst day the world ever had came not in some dead season, but in spring, with the new leaves out and the whole northern half of the planet tilting toward its brightest months. Stand by a river channel in the north of the continent then, on that bright spring morning. The water is clear and cool, fish are feeding in the shallows. Behind you, a herd is moving through the new growth, and the air is full of the ordinary sounds of a world going about its day. And then, low in the southern sky, there is a new point of light, a second sun very far off that should not be there at all. It is faint at first. Over the next little while, it grows. What was growing in the sky was a rock about the size of a mountain, 10 kilometers across, perhaps 15, call it the bulk of Mount Everest, and it was coming in fast, at something like 20 kilometers every second, 60 times the speed of a rifle bullet. It had been falling toward this morning for a very long time. Recent work on its chemistry suggests it had formed far out in the cold of the early solar system, somewhere beyond the orbit of Jupiter, and had drifted in across the ages on a long, patient path. That path happened, out of all the empty space it could have crossed, to end here, on this exact spring morning, on this exact world. There was nothing personal in it. It was just a piece of the early solar system, keeping an appointment that no one had made. And then it arrived. It struck in what is now the Gulf of Mexico, off the edge of the Yucatan Peninsula, at a steep angle that, of all the ways it might have come in, was close to the worst possible. In a fraction of a second, it punched through the air, through the shallow sea and deep into the rock of the earth, and released all at once more energy than the mind has any way to hold. Picture, if it helps, 100 million of the largest bombs humanity has ever built set off in a single instant, in a single place. Where it hit, it opened a crater more than 180 kilometers across, a hole in the planet you could not see over, that you could drive across for 2 hours and still not reach the far rim. And the rock it happened to strike could hardly have been worse chosen. It was a sea floor rich in sulfur and limestone, the very stuff that, thrown high into the sky, would do the most harm to the world's climate in the years to come. Change almost any detail, a shallower angle, a few minutes difference in the turning of the earth that put the strike out in deep ocean, a seafloor with less sulfur in it, and the day might have been survivable. It was none of those things. It was the worst version of itself. From space, in that instant, the earth would have shown a single point of unbearable brightness on its curve, and then a slow grey bloom spreading out from it. The page of the world turned on that brightness. What happened next happened fast and across the whole planet. The blow was so violent that it set the solid earth ringing. Great waves rolled out through rock and sea, reaching thousands of kilometers within minutes. Far to the north, in the very place where we began this morning, by that quiet river, the ground heaved and a wall of water surged up the channel within the hour. There is a remarkable deposit in North Dakota at a site called Tanis that some researchers believe caught exactly this. Fish were flung up and buried within an hour of the impact, with tiny beads of melted rock, fallen back out of the sky, lodged in their gills. Not everyone agrees on every detail, and it is best held with some care. But if it is right, then we are looking at the fossil record of a single hour, 66 million years ago. Overhead, the sky itself was changing. Molten rock thrown clear of the impact had arched out beyond the air and was now raining back down across the whole world, glowing as it fell, turning the upper sky a dull furnace red and pouring heat down onto everything below. Whatever else that day was, it was, for a few hours, the same day everywhere on Earth. It is tempting to tell this as the worst thing that ever happened, and in one sense it was, the most violent single day the Earth has known in all the time we can read. But that is not quite how it sits, seen from far enough away. From the long view we have been taking all along, the view of mountains and chalk and drifting continents in which 1,000,000 years is a short chapter, that afternoon is not an ending so much as a hinge. Earth had turned the page before, many times in slower ways. This time it simply turned fast. The continents did not stop drifting. The oceans did not boil away. Our planet was barely scratched. A crater 180 kilometers wide is, on a world 13,000 kilometers across, hardly more than a pinprick. What changed was not the Earth. It was who got to go on living on it. The Earth has taken bigger wounds and kept turning, and time is the one thing it has always had in abundance. Given enough of it, even the worst day becomes a layer, a thin grey line you could lay a single finger across. The largest event in the whole story is, in the end, an almost peaceful seam in the stone. But the day itself was not what emptied the world. The impact and the burning sky and the first terrible hours, all of it was over within a day or two, and a great deal survived it. Animals in burrows and in water, in the shade and underground, came through that first violence alive. The world was not killed that day. It was wounded and then left to see what could hold on, because what the impact had thrown into the sky, the dust, the soot, the sulfur from that unlucky sea floor, did not settle quickly. It spread around the whole planet and hung there, a veil drawn between the world and the sun. And so the spring morning we began with gave way, not to another ordinary day, but to something the earth had not known in a very long time and would not shake off for years. The light began to fail, and the long dark came down. Afterward, the loudest thing in the world is what is no longer there. In the weeks after the impact, as the dust thickened and the sky closed over, the great noise of the Cretaceous simply stopped. No herds in the dawn, no calls rolling across the valleys, no bird song of the kind that had filled these forests for millions of years. The Tyrant does not roar, nothing large stirs the warm seas. The floodplains lie still. There is only a grey, dim, settling quiet, and it does not lift in a day or a season. It lasts for years. What had come down was an impact winter. The dust and soot and sulphur thrown up by the strike spread around the whole planet and hung there, high in the air where no wind could clear it, a veil drawn across the sun. And almost everything alive runs, in the end, on sunlight. With the light cut off, the world went cold and dark together, temperatures falling by as much as 15 degrees, an ice age's worth of cooling arriving not across thousands of years, but in a single one. Fine dust may have hung in the air for as long as 15 years. For up to 2 of those years, 2 whole growing seasons, there may have been too little light for plants to grow at all. The engine of the living world, the quiet machinery of leaves turning sunlight into food, simply stopped. It is hard to picture and harder to feel. Imagine a year and then another, in which the sun is never more than a dim coin behind the murk or gone altogether. The forests, denied light, drop their leaves and do not grow them back, standing bare and grey and silent for season after season. Ground freezes that has not frozen in tens of millions of years. Snow falls on a world that had forgotten snow, and over all of it lies that strange, dim, ashen light, neither day nor night, going on, while the living things that remain go quiet and still and wait. Exactly which of these did the most killing is something we are still working out. For a long time, the sulphur took most of the blame. Lately, careful new models point instead to the fine dust and the soot as the great blockers of the sun, with sulphur playing a smaller part than once believed. Out in the oceans, sulphur and other gases came down as acid rain and soured the surface waters, dissolving the shells of the smallest sea creatures faster than they could build them. And in the background, those long eruptions in India had already been straining the climate before any of this. Untangling how much was the asteroid and how much the volcano, and exactly when each did its harm, is something specialists genuinely still argue over. What is not in doubt is the shape of it. The light failed, the cold came, the plants died back, and from there the failure climbed. And the way it climbed tells us who was in the most danger. The dying did not begin with the great predators at all. It began at the very bottom, among the green things, where the light had gone. When the plants failed, the plant eaters had nothing left to eat, and the largest of them needed the most. When the plant eaters failed in turn, the great hunters that lived on them starved last of all. A body the size of the Tyrant, which had to find enormous amounts of food every week, had no way through a world that had stopped making food. To be big in that long dark was to be doomed. The same logic ran through the sea. With the sunlit plankton gone, the creatures that grazed on them starved, and the great marine hunters above them starved in turn. Everywhere, the failure ran upward, from the small and green to the large and hungry to the largest and hungriest of all. And so, over those dark years, the caste we have travelled with came, one by one, to the end of its road. The non-avian dinosaurs, every last one of them, the Tyrant and the horned giants and the duck-billed herds, the polar nesters and the southern colossi, were gone. The great flying reptiles, the giants with the wingspans of small aircraft, came out of the sky for the last time. In the sea, the mosasaurs and the long-necked plesiosaurs vanished. And so, at last, did the ammonites. Those coiled survivors that had ridden out every catastrophe for more than 300 million years, undone in the end by a sea too sour to build a shell in. Even most of the birds went, the toothed and clawed birds that had ruled the Cretaceous era, gone with the forests they had lived in. By the time it was over, roughly 3 out of every 4 kinds of living thing on Earth were gone. A whole world's worth of the familiar, almost everything this long journey has shown us, was simply gone. But the world was not emptied, it was filtered. The same dark that doomed the large and the specialized was survivable, just barely, by a particular kind of creature. And the list of who made it through reads almost like a moral. These survivors were small so that a little food went a long way. They were unfussy, able to live on seeds, on dead wood, on the bodies of the dead, on whatever the ruined world still offered, rather than on the fresh green leaves that no longer grew. Many of them could hide, in a burrow, under the soil, in the mud of a riverbed. Many more lived in fresh water, where food chains run on rot, not sunlight. The role of survivors reads small and humble: crocodiles and turtles, frogs and salamanders, lizards and snakes, ground-dwelling birds that could crack a seed and live on it. And down in their burrows, the small warm mammals kept low, ate little, and waited, the way they had always known how to do. There is a strange justice in it. The very things that had kept the mammals small and humble all through the age of giants, their modest size, their night habits, their willingness to eat almost anything, were exactly the things that now carried them through. 150 million years of keeping low had been, without anyone planning it, a long apprenticeship in survival. And one of those small, warm things in the dark is the reason you are here to hear about it. Somewhere, in a burrow under the ruined ground, a small, furred animal, one we would recognize as a deep ancestor of our own, was still breathing. Its heart was still beating, its body still warm, kept alive by seeds and insects and sheer patience. It did not know it was surviving anything. It knew only the dark, the cold, the next small meal, and the need to keep still and keep going. But it was on your family line. Every person who has ever lived, including you, traces back, through an unbroken thread of such nights, to some small creature exactly like it, keeping warm in the dark of the worst year the Earth has ever had. Not one link in that chain ever broke. Not in the long night, not in any danger before or since. It is a thin thread and an unimaginably old one, and it runs straight from a frightened warm animal in a Cretaceous burrow to you, lying here in the dark tonight, listening. And the dark did not last forever. Nothing in this world ever does. Slowly, over years, not days, the dust thinned and settled, and fell at last out of the sky as a fine grey rain, leaving behind it that single centimetre of clay that would one day tell us the whole story. The veil wore through. The cold eased. And one ordinary morning, no different from any other in the long grey stretch behind it, a little more light came through than the day before. It was not much, a paler grey, a thinning of the gloom, the first hint of a sun the world had almost forgotten. But it was enough. After the longest night the Earth has ever known, the morning was coming back. It begins again with a single fern. In the grey, ash-choked ground of the first year after, the forest's gone, the giants gone, the boundary clay still settling out of the sky. One of the first living things to push back up into the dim light is a fern, the tight green fist of its frond slowly uncurling. Ferns are the great opportunists of the plant world. Their dust-fine spores ride the wind for enormous distances, and they take hold on burned, broken, lifeless ground faster than almost anything else alive. And so, in the rock just above that thin grey line, the record fills for a geological moment with fern spores, a brief, strange interval when the recovering Earth was very nearly a planet of ferns, green creeping back across the scars. It did not last long, but it was the first green, the first sign that the long machinery of life had not, after all, been switched off. The morning had a colour again, and the colour was green. From that first green, the world slowly rebuilt itself, from the bottom up. The ferns gave way to returning forests. The forests fed the insects, and the insects fed the things that ate insects, and rung by rung, over thousands and then millions of years, the whole ladder of the living world was raised again. But it was raised, this time by different hands. The great reptiles that had filled every large role on land for 150 million years were gone, and they were not coming back. Not the tyrants, not the horned herds, not the long-necked giants. All the space they had occupied, every way of making a living that their bulk had monopolized, lay suddenly open. And into that emptied world stepped the survivors of the long night, the crocodiles and the turtles, the seed-cracking birds, the frogs and the lizards, and, above all for what came next, the small warm mammals that had waited out the dark in their burrows. The flowering plants too came fully into their own now. We left them, early in this story, as low weeds on broken ground, one green thread among the conifers and the ferns, and it was here, in the world the asteroid had emptied, that they finally took it over. The recovering forests grew up around blossom and fruit. In time would come the grasses and the open plains, and the whole green machinery of the world we know. The quiet revolution that had begun in the Cretaceous Understory among the very first small flowers reached its full flowering, the word is exact, only after the giants who had grazed beneath it were gone. For the mammals, the change was as sudden as anything in the fossil record. In one beautifully preserved stretch of rock in Colorado, paleontologists have read the first few 100,000 years after the impact almost like a diary and watched the mammals balloon in size, their average body mass rising perhaps 100-fold in that short span, from small things you could have cupped in 2 hands to creatures the size of a large dog, and then larger still. Within a few million years, there were mammals as big as the smaller dinosaurs had been. Within a few tens of millions, there were whales in the oceans and the ancestors of elephants on the plains. The age of mammals, our age, had begun, but it matters to see what kind of beginning it really was. It was not a fresh creation, not a clean new start. It was a continuation, the same small, warm, overlooked lineage from the Cretaceous Understory, kept alive through the dark by its very smallness, and now, at last, handed a whole world to grow into. None of this was quick, by the measure of a human life. The first ferns came within years, the small mammals stirred almost at once, but a full world, complex, layered, as rich as the one that had been lost, took a very long time to build. Hundreds of thousands of years for the forests to thicken, millions for the new large animals to appear, tens of millions before the planet was once again as crowded and various as it had been on that last ordinary Cretaceous morning. Recovery in deep time is not a sudden spring after winter. It is a slow, patient reassembling, layer upon layer, with no hurry and no plan. The same unhurried work that had built the Cretaceous world in the first place, beginning over again from almost nothing. And our own thread runs right through the middle of it. The oldest animals we are willing to call primates, the deep root of the branch that leads to lemurs and monkeys and apes, and to us, turn up in the rock astonishingly soon after the catastrophe, within something like 100,000 years of the worst day the Earth has ever had. 100,000 years sounds long, and by the measure of a human life it is. But against the 66 million years that have passed since, it is the very next morning. Almost as soon as the dust had settled and the forests had found their feet, the lineage that would one day stand upright and look at the layers in a cliff and slowly work all of this out was already quietly on its way. We did not arrive in spite of that catastrophe. In a real and humbling sense, we arrived because of it. And that is where this long story comes to its hardest questions, the ones the rock has not answered and perhaps never will. We can say, in broad strokes, what survived and why. The small, the unfussy, the hidden, the ones that needed little and could eat almost anything. But we cannot fully say why the line fell exactly where it did. Why did this lineage of birds come through and that one vanish? Why did the crocodiles endure when the mosasaurs, so superbly built for their world, did not? Why were 3 of every 4 kinds of living thing erased, and the 4th, by some narrow margin, spared? We still argue over what did most of the killing and over whether the dinosaurs were already slipping before the end or were cut down in their full prime. The deeper we look, the more the answers dissolve into the particular, the contingent, the matter of plain luck. And luck, in the end, is the vertiginous heart of it. The asteroid struck a shallow, sulfur-rich sea floor at a steep and unlucky angle on an ordinary spring morning, and almost every one of those details could have been otherwise. Had it arrived just a few minutes earlier or later, the turning of the Earth would have set that same spot out over deep ocean, where the strike would have done a fraction of the harm. Had it come in at a gentler angle or struck a seabed with less sulfur in it, the world might have shrugged off the blow and kept its giants. By margins as thin as minutes, the dinosaurs might still be the lords of this planet, and there would be no one here on any quiet night to lie awake and wonder about them. We are, quite literally, the children of a near miss that was not in the end missed, and we cannot say, and we never will be able to say, that any of it had to happen this way. It did not have to, it simply did. The whole of us, every life that has been lived in all the time since, rests on the chance fall of a single stone. Step back now from the questions and the long climb and notice what is, very plainly, still here. The Cretaceous did not entirely end. One branch of the dinosaurs, the small, feathered, warm-blooded branch that had already learned to fly, came through the long night down among the seed-eaters and the ground-dwellers, and on the far side of the catastrophe it did exactly what survivors do. It spread. It moved back into the recovering forests and out across every continent and every ocean, dividing and dividing again, until today there are something like 11,000 kinds of them alive, more species than there are of mammals. We call them birds, but not one of them is anything other than a dinosaur, the living, singing end of the same long line that ran through the Tyrant and the horned herds and the feathered hunters of the Chinese lakes. The dinosaurs were never all destroyed. One kind of them had chosen ages before the end to be small and warm and feathered, and that ancient choice carried it straight through the fire. So the next time a bird lands at a window or starts up singing in the grey light before dawn, you might let yourself hear it for what it truly is, a small, surviving dinosaur going about an ordinary morning 66 million years after the sky fell in. And it is not only the birds. The whole of this story is still here, all around, once you have the eyes for it. The chalk we began with, that soft white rock built from the bodies of uncountable tiny lives, is still here, in the cliffs and the quarries, under the fields, built into the walls of old cathedrals. We have been living on the floor of a Cretaceous sea the whole time. The thin grey line of clay, the ash of the single worst day, lies in the rock beneath every continent, one dark page bound into a very long book. And we ourselves are made, through and through, of the survivors. The warmth your body makes for itself, the milk you were fed before you had any words, the particular colours you can see and the ones you cannot. The simple fact that you find the night a natural time to go quiet and still, all of it was shaped down in the Cretaceous understory, in the dark, by small creatures keeping low and waiting. The chalk and the buried ash, and the bird at the window, and the warm person lying here in the dark, listening. These are not separate things at all. They are one story, the same story, still going on. And widen the frame once more, as far as it will reach. The stone that ended the Cretaceous had come from the cold dark beyond Jupiter, out of the leftover rubble of the solar system's own beginning, so that the story of life on this one planet is bound up, in the end, with the story of the whole sky. We live on a small world, in a quiet corner of an ordinary galaxy, circling an ordinary star, and that world has been struck before, and will be struck again. It has frozen and burned and drowned and recovered over and over across spans of time that make the whole of human history a single bright afternoon. And yet here it still is. And here, astonishingly, are we, a way for that small world to look up at the same sky the asteroid once fell out of and slowly begin to understand it. There is a thought to sit with here at the very end, in the quiet. We are taught to fear endings, to feel the great extinctions and our own small mortality as nothing but loss, as the dark drawing in. But the earth does not seem to keep its accounts that way. In this long story, every ending turned out to be also a handing on. The drowned chalk seas became the white cliffs. The fallen giants made room for the small and the warm. And the single worst morning the world has ever known cleared the ground for the long morning that, in time, made us. Nothing here was ever only an ending. Each one was a door swinging shut in a house of countless rooms, and somewhere down the corridor another door easing open. We are the inheritors of every catastrophe that came before us, and we are also the one part of the earth, the small and late part, that has learned to turn around and look back and see that this is so. After 4 billion years of forgetting, continents drifting apart with no memory of their old shapes, oceans erasing their own coastlines, whole living worlds rising and vanishing with no witness at all, the planet has, in us, grown a way of remembering itself, of everything the long story has made. The largest, the fiercest, the most enduring, this may be the strangest and the most precious, the part that finally learned to remember. So let all of it settle now, the way silt settles down through still water and comes, at last, to rest on the floor of a quiet sea. The world coming apart and the new oceans opening between the drifting lands. The first flowers, low among the ferns. The feathered hunters in their real colours, the warm, shallow seas and their long-necked giants, the herds moving through the river mist at dawn, the tyrant at rest in the heat of the afternoon, the great wings crossing the sky, the small nest kept warm through the 4-month dark, the long, ordinary summer of all of it, and the single bright morning it ended on, the night that followed, and the small, warm heart still beating in its burrow through the worst of the dark. And then the green creeping back, and the slow, patient climb from there to here, to a world of birds and mammals, and one wakeful creature lying in the dark, holding the whole of it in mind. None of it was wasted, none of it was for nothing. Every lost world fed the world that came after, in an unbroken line that runs all the way down to this one, all the way down to you. It is an enormous thing to hold. 66 million years, and the 77 million before that, and the 4 billion before that. But it does not have to weigh on you tonight. It can do the opposite. It can hold you up. The very scale that makes us small is the scale that makes us safe, because nothing that troubles you tonight is large set against all that time. The message can wait. The worry can wait until morning. The earth has come through far worse mornings than the one ahead of you, and kept turning, and made oceans, and made flowers, and made birds, and made you. So rest. You are the far end of a very long story, and the story is in no hurry. Neither now are you. The chalk is still falling. Tonight, in seas you will never see. The birds will still be there in the morning, small dinosaurs singing up the light, and the deep time you have been walking through all this long while is not somewhere far off, locked away in the rock. It is in you. It is the slow, deep tide you are floating out on now as you let go. The world came apart and came back together again. The giants rose and ruled and fell and left the morning to the small. The long night came and the long night ended. And here, at the end of all of it, you are, warm and breathing and awake in the dark, made of survivors, holding the whole long story safe in a mind the earth grew across an unimaginable span for exactly this. There is nothing left to do with it now but set it gently down. Let the continents drift and the chalk keep falling, and the patient old world turn without you, just for this one night. You have come a very, very long way to be here. Rest now, sleep well,